For people who are joining, we're just going to wait about another minute or so just to let everybody kind of filter in. So that's why you're not hearing anything except me right now. Okay, Nadine, Jeff, why don't we just kick it off here? So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's program, Conversation to Learn about the final report issued last month by Harvard Medical School's Working Group on Open Inquiry. The working group was formed in the spring of 2025 to explore the state of open inquiry and public discourse in the HMS community and to provide guidance on how to best promote a culture of respectful dialogue, scholarly debate, and engagement across differences. It's an important report that describes how many people in the HMS community find it hard to speak about difficult subjects. And the report recommends a series of steps to help overcome those difficulties. Today's program is co-sponsored by Harvard Alumni for Free Speech, the Academic Freedom Alliance, the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, the Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, Heterodox Academy, Princeton Alumni for Free Speech, and the Voices for Liberty Initiative. I'm John Evangelakis, the president of Harvard Alumni for Free Speech, and it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our two speakers. They're both highly accomplished and widely recognized for their contributions and commitment to advancing free speech, academic freedom, and open inquiry. We have today Dr. Jeffrey Flier, former dean of Harvard Medical School and chair of the HMS Working Group on Open Inquiry that prepared the report. And discussing the report with him will be Nadine Strossen, former president of the ACLU and a senior fellow with Flier. And I just want to personally say that Harvard Alumni for Free Speech is very fortunate that both Nadine and Jeff are members of our advisory board. Later in today's program, we're going to turn to your questions. If you want to ask anything about the report or its implications, please submit your question by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I think I just was playing with it. For some of you, you may have to click on the More button to find the Q&A. But yeah, please enter your questions using the Q&A button rather than the chat feature. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Nadine and Jeff.
Thank you so much, John, and many thanks to you and Liz for arranging this important webinar. I would also like to thank the Harvard Alumni for Free Speech for your fantastic advocacy on academic freedom and free speech. I've been very, very proud to be an active member. You're helping Harvard to live up to its motto of Veritas, and I'm showing my respect by wearing my Harvard crimson. And I'd also like to thank all of the wonderful co-sponsors who are also doing great work on academic freedom, free speech, and open inquiry. What an honor to be with you, Jeff. You have been such a leader on this front, not only at Harvard Medical School, at Harvard University more broadly, but way beyond that as the president of Heterodox Academy, which is doing this work all over the United States and even beyond. I also want to congratulate and thank you and other members of your working group for a fantastic report, and I highly recommend. And it's admirably succinct, so I highly recommend it to everybody to look at the report itself. But Jeff, before we turn to the working group's report and recommendations, it would really be interesting to hear about the background. What gave rise to it? Were there particular incidents or concerns?
Yes. Well, first, let me just echo your statement of thanks to the Harvard Alumni for Free Speech and John Evangelakis, and state that it's a profound honor for me to have this conversation with you. I've admired you for decades, long before this was an area of my particular post-decanal interest. So let me just give then a little background, maybe 4 or 5 minutes of how I think we got here. So personally, I'll just say that after completing my time as dean of the medical school, I began to focus my attention on other issues related to higher education at Harvard and more broadly outside of Harvard. And I became concerned about the state of open inquiry. We'll talk about what that means as we go along. Uh, but the first thing that I did was I joined the board of Heterodox Academy. I've been on that board, and then I'm not the president, I'm the chair of the board
Mhm.
since September. Um, and that's a group that has been focused on this topic for higher education for a decade at this point. I also got involved with a group of Harvard faculty, and I was one of the founding co-presidents of the Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard, that now has a couple of hundred members from all the different schools at Harvard. And that came into being in March of 2023. I will say that for most of this time, my personal passion for this topic was rarely accompanied by visible interest by university leadership at Harvard or elsewhere, or even the broader Harvard faculty that I could see. So it was kind of a quest for, my personal interest in this area. But this began to change several years ago for a variety of reasons, and I won't go into all the possible reasons, but one acute event was the events of October 7th, 2023, the fact that that brought about many different actions on campuses that were a cause for concern for many people about how universities were handling these things. Um, the first indication that something was changing at Harvard really occurred in February of 2024, when the new president at Harvard, then the interim, but now the real president of Harvard, Alan Garber, announced shortly after he took that role that he was creating a faculty working group to assess the state of open inquiry and constructive dialogue at Harvard. He named two co-chairs that were eminent professors, Eric Beerbohm from the government department, who also headed the SAFRA Center for Ethics, and Tomiko Brown-Nagin, constitutional lawyer and the dean of the Radcliffe School. And then there were 8 other members joined them from across the university. They did a lot of work that's described in the report that they issued, I believe was October 1st in 2024. And this was a really impressive document. And the amazing thing when I read the document was that they stated that the state of open inquiry at Harvard was in fact a national crisis that must be addressed. This was the title of an op-ed written by the two co-chairs the day the report was released. So the fact that this report was released and it came out of the president of the university asking for it and a distinguished panel, that they were collecting information, they had survey data and many other things. I thought this was itself very important. But then I wondered, as did many people, what additional steps would be taken. So it's nice to have a report, but what is that going to mean? Then I learned that the provost had created an implementation group in early 25, and then in April 25, I received an email from George Staley, dean of the medical school who succeeded me, asking if I would agree to serve as the chair of such a panel looking at this at specifically Harvard Medical School. And I was honored to accept that. I was told that I could lead the process. I'd have administrative support from the dean's office. And the dean also suggested a variety of members for the panel representing the broad array of people who do the work at Harvard in the education, the research, the clinical, the administrative areas. I suggested a couple of other people to be added on who I knew were very dedicated to open inquiry. And we started our work in May. And the bottom line is we worked really hard. We had 17 meetings from early May to December. Almost everybody was present at every meeting, a few people virtually, most live. We had a whole series of discussions to learn about each other, to learn about the topic. We had external people come in and talk to us. We did listening sessions, and then I drafted a report that went through 10 or more revisions with every single member making suggestions. And then we finally got a report that we sent to the dean in December. And then it took a few months, but with almost no substantial edits, the dean released the report on April 21st. So that's how we got to where we are today. And I'm happy to answer any other questions about it. It was an honor to work with the 15 other members, extraordinary people, some of whom I knew, some of whom I didn't know. And we were all dedicated to doing the best that we could do to put out this report.
Jeff, thanks for that fascinating background. And thank you for reminding us that there had been a prior report on a similar issue university-wide earlier. And that called to my mind an even earlier report that was done about DEI, which was co-chaired by Danielle Allen, who has subsequently complained, including quite recently, that the recommendations of that report were never implemented. In particular, that their committee, which was very illustrious. Danielle herself is
Yeah.
a rare university professor, and the others were equally distinguished. And they had a very powerful conception of meaningful diversity, equity, and inclusion, as including diversity of ideas and perspectives, as well as diversity of identity. And they had very powerful language about how academic freedom and free speech are absolutely integral to the whole DEI effort. And that was several years earlier than the
Yes.
Garber report that you're talking about. But apparently that was not followed up. So sometimes a good idea has to be surfaced multiple times
Yeah.
before it will actually be acted upon.
Yes, well, I'll say I have enormous regard for Danielle Allen. She was one of the first people to join the Council on Academic Freedom and remains a member. I ended up having a discussion with her after I went back and read the report that she issued, whenever it was, 3, 4 years ago. And I was amazed how much emphasis she put on viewpoint diversity and open inquiry. And then I was aware that she wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post several years ago where she specifically said that the people who implemented her report, which was not her, basically lost the message and only focused on one or two elements of diversity and not diversity of viewpoint and opinion and scholarship. And she was very unhappy with that. So you're exactly right in what you just said.
And as all of the lawyers on the call will recognize, including yours truly, you can have the best report, including the best opinion from a court in the world, and it means nothing unless the
Yeah,
officials who are responsible for implementing policy actually take some steps. So we'll get to the implementation
yeah.
in a moment. But first, Jeff, was there, before I ask you to summarize the recommendations, was there any controversy about the either the appointment of the committee or its charge or its composition, either at the outset or as it went through its process or after the
Yeah.
report was issued?
The short answer is not that I'm aware of. I didn't hear any public or private opposition. What is this about? Why are they doing this? This is the wrong group. I did not hear any of that. And in the follow-up to the report being released, I mainly got a lot of direct comments saying, wow, thank you. This is great. Now, does that mean that everyone out there is delighted at the report and every element of it? Probably not. That would be hard to believe, but I haven't heard about opposition.
Okay, so can you please tell us about the major findings and recommendations?
Yeah, okay. So I will try to run through in about 7 minutes or something the main recommendations. We actually came up with 11 recommendations and we had a prologue, and I'll tell you what each of them were. Some are a little more complicated than others, some are pretty simple. Uh, First thing is we had a prologue, and we wanted to say right at the beginning that our whole group enthusiastically supported the fact that Harvard University and Harvard Medical School are taking on this subject. We recognized in the prologue that this would require even more than policies, a cultural change. Cultural change is hard to achieve. And therefore, we said right at the top that whatever happens when a report is issued, assuming it gets issued, which we didn't know when we handed it in, that it would require repeated articulations by leaders of the school and the university. It would require programming to help people understand how best to accommodate the needs of this cultural change. And ideally, it will require key members of the community to model what this looks like. So it's not just imagining it, but you're seeing people like deans and former deans show what it's like to do this kind of thing properly. So that was the prologue. Then the first recommendation really came out of many discussions that we had, where we ended up concluding that to have the cultural change that is needed, we need increased trust. And of course, that's complicated and difficult, but how would we do that? And we came up with a agreed upon fact that we should articulate what some people decided to call, we all agreed, a social compact that would reflect the values that underlie what we want to see happen. And I'll just read very briefly the 5 social compacts because they're beautiful in my opinion. And someone else recommended them, and then everyone said, yeah, that's right. So the first is that in discussing a complicated issue, make your case with evidence and logic and cite contrary evidence where it's relevant. Secondly, show curiosity and intellectual charitability towards whoever might disagree with you. Thirdly, be intellectually humble and be willing to change your mind when there are reasons to do that from the conversation at hand. Be constructive, seek understanding, and if you're going to criticize something, criticize ideas, but not people. And then finally, be yourself. Have the courage to share your viewpoints in a culture of trust that we would like to see.
Jeff,
So,
if I could interject, that is essentially the principles that Heterodox Academy
yeah,
has endorsed and calls it the heterodox way.
yeah. So in the statement, amazingly, and people can believe this or not, I didn't bring it up, but one of our other members, who I didn't even know was a member of Heterodox Academy, said, how about that? We can't improve on that. And everybody agreed. So I didn't put that in there, but I fully endorse it. Now, secondly, we made the point that the school isn't ready to make all of this happen just de novo with our existing people and programs. So we should develop and deploy materials and programs that would support these changes. And one of the things that we recommended that in the orientation programs for medical students, graduate students, new faculty, at the beginning of courses, these ideas should be brought forward. Now, one of the things that was great that several months into this, as we're talking about this, someone raised their hand and said, I've heard that the medical school has signed an agreement with this Constructive Dialogue Institute, which was an offshoot of Heterodox Academy, and it now has programs to orient students at over 100 universities in open inquiry. And it turns out the medical school was already working with them. And exactly when they started, I don't know, but in this past January, they had a train the trainers program. And then this summer, for the orientation session, they're going to be exposed to something called perspectives, which is now being given at 120 to 40 other, schools around the country. And then there's also I was told, I haven't heard the finalization of this, but there's a group of medical schools that is working conjointly on this called the Kern National Network. And I was told that Harvard Medical School is in the process of joining them or maybe already has joined them. So that was the second thing. Do the work that needs to be done to let this start soon. Okay. The third issue was a very broad issue and an important issue we spent a lot of time on. So that was, yeah, there are issues that are true in any institute of higher learning, at Harvard College, at Harvard Kennedy School, at Harvard Law School. But what about the issues that are really relevant specifically to medicine? We should give disproportionate attention to that, which I would point out the same issues that are true around the rest of the university are true at the medical school. But yes, let's look at what are the issues that are specific to medicine. And here are the things to point out. So it was determined and recognized that we hear back from our students in particular courses. This isn't true in the biochemistry courses where there's not a lot of need for open inquiry, I think. But it's in the courses that relate to topics like health policy, medical ethics, and social medicine. These are the areas where political lenses come in. And we have students who have reported to us over the years, we now know, because we looked at some of the data, that they are not given the opportunity to have alternative views to a dominant narrative about what is the best policy on this, that, and the other thing. These are areas where there are legitimate disagreements. And
Jeff,
they're,
can I
yes,
ask a question about the students? Because
sure.
I believe in one of the appendices that was describing the really commendably great number of listening sessions you had and some surveys. I had the impression that the student participation level was not that high. Please correct me if I'm
Yeah.
wrong about that, but I was concerned because I thought maybe the students are even deterred from expressing their complaints even through this
Yeah.
process.
Well, I can't say that I know that that's true, but what I do know is this. We wanted to meet with students. We were told by the medical education group with whom we were in many conversations that the best way would be to ask to a meeting what's called the medical education reps. These are several people from each class that get chosen. I don't know if they're elected or what, and they get asked their opinions on many issues. So, working with them, we said, we're going to have a session with you. 5 of us are going to be there. Can you please come? And out of the, I don't know, 12 or 15 med ed reps, only 2 appeared. And some of them were saying that students are, not typically willing to put their necks out, especially if they have minority views. But we didn't get to then speak with a lot of students. We tried, and the appendix describes how we wanted to do a survey of students. We did a lot of work in the background to get some survey questions on this topic. And then we were we were discouraged or prevented or whatever from doing that. And the reason was a reasonable reason. The medical school is in the midst of preparing for its accreditation with the AAMC. As part of that, they have several structured, surveys, and they didn't want to start throwing in additional surveys during that period. So, as I'll get to, we make one of our recommendations is to have future repetitive surveys of all the relevant groups. So,
Thank you.
that was it. The other thing that we learned was as we were moving along, getting ready to draft our report, was that in the session at the end of August, which I used to do when I was the dean of the medical school, the dean of medical education, welcome all the incoming students in a big live session. And I was given their statements, which included very prominent statements from both those deans to the incoming students that this is a place where you're going to be challenged. We're not going to tell you to be afraid of controversy. Controversy is how you learn, think critically, and all of that. And then the dean of the medical school also said, and when it comes to clinical care and patients, you leave your politics at the door. I was very delighted to see those comments that were already there before we had written our report. And then another topic I'll just briefly mention that we spend much time on was activism. And I'll just give the briefest thing, because if you hang around Harvard Medical School, you know there's a lot of activism by students, by some faculty. And the question that arose is not that activism is a thing to be discouraged generally. No, many people want to be activists. They're delighted to be activists, and they should be activists. The question is, what about the border between activism and education and activism in medical care? And that's an area where we raised alerts about there being some borders that shouldn't be crossed. And then
I'd
I'll
like to
just,
say, Chef, I'd
yeah,
like to say
sure,
something about that as both
sure.
an educator and an activist. The report is excellent. The appendices are also fascinating. And one of the appendices was a fabulous memo that you wrote about this very issue. And I thought it really modeled those heterodox academy values, and now we can say your report's values, because I thought you did a very fair job of laying out the pros and the cons of the
Yeah.
role that activism plays in medical education.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it greatly because, I presented the report at one of our meetings, and then people thought, maybe you should put it in the appendix rather than, take up a large section of the report. So it's in the appendix, and you're right. I did try to say, here are the reasons that activism is good. Here are some of the questions. Here's how to, deal with it in the real world. And thank you very much. So then a couple of the other points coming up are much briefer. So we had a section on how to deal with open inquiry and constructive dialogue, specifically in the classroom setting. And it turns out the medical school had already adopted or was adopting at that time the Chatham House rule, the non-attribution rule, because there were instances where people were being quoted for what they said and torn down in social media. That is not going to be, viewed as appropriate any longer. We also talked about the use in controversial classes of anonymous class polling, which is hopefully going to be implemented, where you ask at the beginning, what do you think about this? And then you put up the answers anonymously, and then people can see, oh, there's a group of people who actually have this other view. Maybe I should be aware of that. And then the approach of, in some topics, assigning there to be people taking the alternative sides of an issue to explore those issues better. So that was a recommendation. And then we also spent a lot of time, and I learned a lot about the issue of how to approach open inquiry in the research and laboratory environment, which is a very different environment, but it's a huge part of the medical school. And people were talking about the unique features of the laboratory environment, the multi-tiered mentorship situation, the power relationship between the principal investigator and then various, students and fellows. And we were learning that the graduate program at the medical school is already building skills and developing case studies about how to deal with that in the laboratory environment. We had a very short piece, which we didn't come to any conclusions, but we said everybody knows that social media is a big deal. It can be used. There are free speech issues in its use, but maybe there should be some guidelines developed. We didn't have enough time to develop them about how people should be aware of social media use and how it could cause things antithetical to the environment of open inquiry that we would like to see. Um, and then I will say point number 7 is one of the most important. And I'll also invite you to make some comment about this because, some people we knew were going to say that all you want to do is shut down certain points of view, which of course is not what we're doing, and will be doing. However, we know people believe that. So we made a very specific point that we have to take steps that any policies and practices that we advise or the school advises in the future be applied in a content neutral manner. This is easily violated, even with the best of intentions. And therefore, in a polarized environment that we know we have it, we need to avoid situations where this is applied, but only selectively. And then where groups are going to say, oh, wait a minute, you're telling me that this is an issue for me, but what about for those folks? So the content neutral application of policies and recommendations is of fundamental importance. Anything you want to say on that?
Well, I'm sorry. The first association that comes to my mind is Claudine Gay's infamous testimony before
Yeah,
Congress, right?
yeah,
Because there was a very double standard about what kind of hate speech is protected or not. And believe me, I believe all of it should be constitutionally protected and we should oppose it in other ways. I wrote a whole book about that.
yes,
But
yes,
I
you
think it
did.
was hard for people to swallow this paean to free speech that came from her and the other presidents when they had been very quick to shut down anything else that was even alleged to be
Right,
hateful regarding other minority groups other than Jewish
precisely.
students and
Yeah,
Zionist
I,
students.
I'm glad you brought that up because that was precisely what um, a number of us were thinking about. Then I'll just quickly say the last 4 recommendations. One was, shockingly to me, the medical school has not been an environment where controversial scientific, medical, and social issues have been subject to discussion in public fora. It's like, how could that be? But it is the case that we haven't had that. So we made a specific recommendation that the dean and the dean's people should be responsible for scheduling regular scholarly fora on controversial issues. And as I said, there are many of those issues that are relevant to medicine and medical science. They just haven't received any time and attention, and they should. In the initial, I will say, the initial draft that I wrote, I mentioned what some of those areas were, and some people felt strongly that we shouldn't specifically mention the issues, let them come up later, because some people will be upset that we're mentioning those issues. I agreed, and overall, we agreed to take those specific issues out. But I said, when it's out, I'm going to talk about what some of those issues are. So in 3 seconds, I will just tell you among the issues are controversial issues regarding sex and gender, regarding race, racism, anti-racism in general and as they relate to health, health policy issues, and various medical ethics issues. So these are the issues where we should be having the best people we can find discussing these from different points of view.
Jeff, if I can add to just because a lot of what you're saying applies beyond Harvard Medical School and beyond medical
Yep.
schools, as you well know, I was quite shocked that in Fire's most recent survey of student attitudes on these issues, and it is the most comprehensive survey that's ever been done. It was done by College Pulse, hundreds of thousands of students,
Yep.
257 campuses, and I was shocked that a majority of students say on campuses across the country say they cannot have a free and frank conversation about abortion. I mean, I
Yes.
knew that race and gender
Yeah. Yeah.
immigration police were very controversial,
Yes.
but abortion was
Well,
really quite shocking.
we have heard that in some of the student survey confidential results that have been told to me confidentially, where, there's a fraction of Harvard medical students, I don't know what the number is, but let's say it's 5%, let's say it's 8%, let's say it's 3%, who themselves, due to religious or other reasons, are against abortion. And they have said they simply cannot say that in a class at Harvard Medical School discussing issues like that. Okay. Now, is that good or bad? It's not good, in my opinion, although some people might think it is good. So there it is. We brought it up. Uh, and then, very briefly, point nine was we said to make this real, the dean should create new awards and recognitions for people and groups who have advanced open inquiry at Harvard Medical School. And we have it for many other accomplishments. Do it for open inquiry. And I could tell you some people and groups that would be very good at doing that right now. Then, two last ones, and this is critical. We said after the report is issued, which it's now a month ago, HMS leadership should create well-defined mechanisms, these are our words, to coordinate, manage, and assess future HMS efforts and monitor progress. There should be recurring surveys and focus groups. And we said if they don't do that, a lot of this will end up being dissipated and turn into nothing. And then finally, the last brief point was we said that Harvard Medical School should support and attempt to coordinate open inquiry efforts across Harvard. Everyone who knows about Harvard knows how decentralized it is. They used to say all the schools are tubs on their own bottoms, but they all report in to the provost, the president, and the governing boards. And my last statement in this recommendation was that we need a coherent, mutually reinforcing, university-wide approach to open inquiry, and this would help Harvard University play a leading national role in this space, which currently it does not do.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. I suspect, John, that we have time for one more question from me before we turn it to the audience. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's right, Nadine.
And so, because we really want to respect the audience's free speech rights, Jeff, this really relates to your last 2 points in your report, which have to do with implementation, not only of this excellent report, but the earlier one that you referred to from Harvard University, not to mention the even earlier one that we talked about.
Yeah.
It seems that these are fine reports that may end up sitting on library shelves. On the other hand, in fairness, as you were discussing, one of the appendices talks about many initiatives that are already taking place at the medical school, and I know
Yeah.
in other facets of the university. So what would you recommend in terms of the most constructive, concrete actions that can and should be taken, not only at the medical school, but across the university to make sure that these wonderful recommendations are turned into reality?
Yes. Well, the short story is, and it is one of our actual recommendations, is that in addition to the dean accepting the report and disseminating the report and praising the report in his action of doing so, my belief, and I'm speaking for myself, my belief is that there should be a standing, at least for a while, committee of the medical school appointed to oversee at least the initial years of the response to these recommendations. And that has not been established yet. I can say that the School of Public Health, with whom I was in contact with their committee leaders, they issued their report about a week after ours, and one of their recommendations, which I think was accepted by their dean, was to have a standing committee on open inquiry so that has not yet been done at the medical school. It could be done tomorrow or not. I was told informally by a couple of people that the current plan is not to have a formal implementation committee, but because this cuts across so many parts of the medical school, it'll be handled in many different parts of the medical school.
Mm.
And my response publicly now is to say that is not the way to make sure that this gets the serious attention that it deserves, because everyone else in their own area, research, education, clinical affairs, administration, they all have a million problems to deal with. And this one may fall off the list. And you need institutional leadership working with the dean to make this happen. So that would be my answer. And I hope that that occurs.
One analogy that has occurred to me throughout discussions now going on for many years among some of us about how to turn these aspirations into reality is think of the broad and pervasive implementation of DEI programs
Yep.
or anti-sexual harassment programs. We can say whether they were good or bad, but they were certainly pervasive and persistent, and everybody took them extremely seriously across the university. And there are so many deans who have those responsibilities, but is there a single dean or associate dean for academic freedom or for open inquiry?
Well, would be nice to see. Or at least a standing committee
Mhm.
that reports to the dean, whose
Mm.
responsibility is to make recommendations, to monitor what is happening. That's what I hope will happen.
Thank you. So, John, to you and to audience members to
Yeah,
share their questions.
let me, this one is okay. Let me read this one. So it says, good education, like good religion, should comfort the afflicted as well as afflict the comfortable. However, the Civil Rights Act protects individuals from hostile environments. Thus, professors who offend almost any student or colleague in the process of teaching or conducting research are subject to administrative sanction. How might we resolve this fundamental conflict? And it's not directed either to Jeff. I think I'd invite both Jeff and Nadine to respond.
I'd love to give Jeff a break and take a first crack at it because it is a legal question about which I have written and spoken a lot. And in fact, one of the problems at where Harvard Law School really took a national lead in resisting pressure that started in the Obama administration, continued through Biden and Trump, of overly broadly defining the concept of hostile environment sexual harassment that constitutes illegal discrimination and therefore has to be countered by the university as a condition for its federal funding. Otherwise, it constitutes prohibited discrimination under Title VI. But the United States Supreme Court has issued only one decision defining consistent with First Amendment freedom of speech when expression can be, or for that matter, other conduct, but certainly expression can be considered illegal hostile environment harassment of the sexual or racial or whoever is offended for whatever reason, only if it is objectively offensive. So it's not a matter of, somebody having very thin skin, and pervasive and persistent sufficiently to deprive the student of an equal educational opportunity. And that is a very tough standard to meet. And beyond that, even if that standard could be satisfied in theory, the university is still liable only if it shows deliberate indifference to complaints that satisfy that standard. So if the university takes reasonable steps to address any such actual hostile environment harassment, that would be enough to exonerate it from any kind of retribution. Unfortunately, under the Obama administration in 2011, sexual harassment of the hostile environment type was overly broadly defined unconstitutionally as including any expression that make about sex or gender that makes anybody uncomfortable. And then that was extended to racial expression, and most recently under Biden and under Trump, anti-Semitic and anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian. Fortunately, courts have been striking, when courts intervene, do strike down those overly broad definitions. But I really wish that they were better known, and that would go a long way toward freeing up the discussion about these sensitive topics.
Well, I'll just add, first of all, it's wonderful to hear Nadine opine on this. Of course, she's one of the great experts. And what I would say, just the one flavor that I would add is coming out of a time period in universities, including Harvard, where there were a lot of excessive concerns about someone being offended and what that meant and how that could be harassment and all the rest. Coming out of that, we're now in a period where, for example, Harvard passed a whole new thing, came out of the corporation about a new policy articulation of harassment and anti-bullying. And even though it has the protections that Nadine is mentioning, many people walked away thinking, boy, I could be subject to a lot of problems if someone just accuses me of that. And we did spend with our committee time with the people at the medical school who are the experts on this topic. And one of our recommendations that I didn't mention, but it's buried in there, is that we have to be very clear with our faculty, students, and staff what is and what is not a violation of those policies. And we need to be very clear about the free speech aspects and to not have too many people afraid to speak because they're afraid there will be misapplication of those kinds of policies.
Great, thank you. So let's, I think this has sparked some interest here in the audience. I think this is a related question, but may I invite you to say more about national, even international leadership that Harvard can provide on the topic of open inquiry and academic freedom that can build on this addressing of standard of deliberate indifference on the one hand and encourage broad and open inquiry in higher education and beyond.
If I can say something, I mentioned that, picking up from Jeff's notion of all the different facets of Harvard being ships on their own bottom, the law school went its own direction quite early on, back when the Obama administration first was insisting on this overly broad concept. And thanks to the leadership of very courageous feminist scholars at Harvard, including Jeannie Suk Gerson and a couple of others. But the rest of the university went in the direction that you're mentioning, Jeff, of pretty much conflating offended and hurt feelings with punishable harassment. So even within Harvard itself, I think a lot more could be done. And I certainly applaud the spirit of autonomy, but when we're talking about First Amendment standards and standards of open inquiry and the pursuit of truth, which should bind the entire university, I think that suggestion is an excellent one. Let's take it university-wide. Yeah. And then to the rest of the country and the rest of the world, as the questioner also asked.
Well, so what I'll add to your wonderful comment is this. At a time when Harvard has been under assault, rightly, wrongly, in many cases wrongly, its reputation is being besmirched. No one can deny that that is a state that we're in now. What could be more exciting than having Harvard leadership, endorsed by the corporation and the president and the provost, state that open inquiry is now a university-wide goal that there is going to be a coordinated activity. So far, it's not coordinated, but some efforts at coordination. That doesn't mean every school has to have the precise same wording of how they discuss the issue, but there should be, if they're not using common wording for something as fundamental as open inquiry and free expression, they have to have a reason why they're not, right? Why should the divinity school have a different approach to it? Maybe there is a reason, but tell us what it is. Harvard should attempt to lead in this area as it should in many other areas.
Okay. I'm sorry, let me just get, here's another one. How do we resolve the tension between the desire to establish open inquiry through dialogue and, in general, the lack of tools for that dialogue that are separate from debate or persuasion? It strikes me that this is the person posing the question as difficult or even impossible to establish environments of mutual understanding when most of the tools at hand have either an explicit or implicit win-lose mindset.
Well, the report and many of our recommendations take up that very critical point. It won't happen by itself. You have to model it. You have to create tools that are available and widely applied. You have to reward it with awards for people in groups that do it. You have to, this is the fact. So is it straightforward and easy that this is all going to happen? No, it's still a huge challenge, but people like myself and Nadine and many others are not going to let go of it. We're not going to let it fade away. It has to be repetitively and effectively repeated.
If I can add 2 points, you mentioned a couple of strategies, Jeff, that seem to be effective at Harvard and elsewhere. One is Chatham House rules. This was stressed by the dean of the law school. My husband and I went to a major law school reunion in the fall, and the provost and the dean of the law school were both extremely strong on these issues and very proud of the Chatham House rules being implemented. I was quite skeptical. It seems to me that everything is so permeable. And I asked both of them afterwards, I mean, no student has violated it. And they said that hadn't happened. So that seems to me to be particularly helpful. And also the anonymity of the surveys. And I know that's been used in other contexts when students tend to exaggerate the extent to which their own views are in a minority because those who are the loudest voices on campus aren't necessarily the most representative. So, using technology to give students the safety, if you will, the security and comfort of knowing that they're not in such a tiny minority, they may not even be in a minority at all, could be extremely helpful. The other thing I have to say is we have to start much earlier than Harvard Med School or even Harvard College. And the Constructive Dialogue Institute and other organizations are working on these issues K through 12 and at Harvard Ed School. I mean, we've got to educate the educators, those who are teaching in K through 12. So this has to be, with Harvard leading is fine, but that leadership has to acknowledge that it has to start at much earlier educational levels.
Completely agree.
Okay, so I have here, I'm going to try to distill this because it's a long question. If free speech is going to thrive, it has to survive contact with the classroom. And that means recognizing the tactics used to shut it down on the ground in real time. So it's and essentially reading on ahead, essentially people try to rebut arguments, not on their merit, but by making it as proof of bad character. How do we answer this? Essentially, it's much longer than that, but I think that's the gist of the question.
I can, as somebody who was a full-time faculty member until quite recently, and in law school, it's especially important. I personally think it's important in all phases of education, but in law school, undeniably, as I said to my students over and over, you have to be able to advocate all plausible perspectives on all issues. So there was no viewpoint discrimination and no viewpoint. In fact, all viewpoints were encouraged. But I imposed viewpoint neutral time, place, and manner regulations to instill in them appropriate modes of discourse for the courtroom, for other professional settings. And in medical school, you would say what's appropriate in patient consultation and so forth, that they had to use a professionally appropriate language. The arguments had to be backed by evidence and analysis. No conclusory points would be accepted, and no ad hominem points would be accepted. So you can, consistent with respecting viewpoint diversity, one can enforce rules of argumentation that would eliminate the name calling and the attribution of evil or negative characteristics to a person who's making an argument you disagree with. And that was one of the principles that you read earlier, Jeff, right? That you disagree with the argument, not with the person.
Yes, and I completely agree. And I would just say that the issue is now being raised with our faculty by the report and hopefully soon after by other articulations, that an approach to the pedagogy of your classroom that permits the kinds of things that were described by the questioner is just not acceptable. You won't be invited to teach if that's the way you teach in the extreme case, but you would get the feedback and you'd get tools to make it more likely that that will not be the way things are, because the culture shifted to a way in which this happened and nobody complained, except a few students, in their confidential course survey.
Moving along here, actually, so this is one's for Jeff. I think some curious. Have you been receiving reactions to the report from beyond Harvard University itself?
A certain number. I mean, it's not like this was put on the front page of the New York Times like some other things are and were, but it is getting out there. And I plan to do some further writing about it now that it's out there. But what I have gotten is, many emails from people and some organizations saying, thank you for doing this. Can I talk with you about it? And I'm happy with that.
May I ask a follow-up question, Jeff? Would you be available? Oh, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if folks at other universities were interested in undertaking similar analyses and reports, could you make yourself or other
Of course.
resources
Yeah, no.
available?
I mean, I have, in essence, made this the focus of my recent post-dean career through various things that I'm doing. And there was a huge effort, not only by me, but by our whole committee to get this report done and now have it out there. And the last thing we want to do is have its impact be lost. So I'd be happy if every medical school wanted to discuss how we did it and what they could do to make it more effective.
I think at this point, I'm going to offer up one more question from the audience and then leave it for Nadine and Jeff to make any final remarks or final questions. So let me just read this. The assault on anything deemed DEI has resulted in the silencing and dismantling of centers and programs on Harvard's campus, including Women's Symposium, Center for the Middle East Studies, etc. How do we ensure that the efforts at academic freedom and open inquiry also are a source of support for and not considered opposition to gender studies, conversations, and programs centering on race, ethnicity, religion, etc.?
To me, the two are indistinguishable because academic freedom and freedom of inquiry and viewpoint diversity is seeking to increase discussion about all of the important issues, certainly including the ones that the questioner mentioned. And I do have heard many reports of excessive efforts to comply with Trump administration orders, very, very broadly interpreting them. But to the extent that the administration is using coercive powers to induce universities to shut down the kinds of serious academic programs or co-curricular programs that you're talking about, that is subject to a First Amendment challenge. And by the way, Harvard has been winning and other universities have been winning in the courts, even if something, and here's a paradox. This isn't a Trump administration initiative, but similar. The state of Indiana required viewpoint diversity defined very vaguely and overly broadly, which reminds me of the language that the Trump administration was trying to foist upon Harvard, mandating that it audit every single department for viewpoint diversity. Well, it may be a goal that we all share, but the means of pursuing it through government coercion and paradoxically, in the name of viewpoint diversity, really suppressing viewpoint diversity.
Yeah.
It's truly Orwellian, invoking a term with positive connotations to bring about exactly the opposite. The good news is it is so blatantly inconsistent with First Amendment values, and the courts have been recognizing that.
I completely 1000% endorse what Nadine said. It gets to the heart of where we are today and the complexity of doing what we're trying to do with open inquiry while we're under attack by forces that don't seem to be truly doing it to enhance, open inquiry, quite the opposite in most cases.
Thank you. So we've actually, Nadine, Jeff, we've come to the end of the hour. It's your final opportunity to get in whatever else you want to say today. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap it up. But anyways, this is an invitation to you.
I would just like to say that the progress that has been made on these issues is in the recent past is so enormous, as Jeff kind of gave us a sense from his outline of the history at Harvard. John, when I think back to when HAFFS, as you call it, was founded, things looked so bleak. Jeff, when the Faculty Academic Freedom Council was founded at Harvard, I believe you were the first in the country. I mean, these were pioneering, tentative steps, and I really think that the progress that has been made in a very short time in shifting the discussion within the university itself, certainly within the general public, is very positive. So that's the good news. The also good news, the even better news, is that we still have our work cut out for us, because nothing is going to change without persistence and in following through, both at Harvard and beyond. So I'd like to thank not only Jeff and John, whom I see on the screen, but everybody else here whom I can't see, for your commitment. It really is so important. And thank you for supporting Harvard Alumni for Free Speech and the other wonderful organizations that are co-sponsoring this webinar.
Well, I'd also add my thanks. I endorse everything that Nadine said. And maybe the little bit that I would add perspective is that it is both a moment of unbelievable opportunity and serious threat. They are both happening at the same time. The opportunity to advance open inquiry, viewpoint diversity in the right sense, all of that is unimaginable compared to what we thought 3, 4, 5 years ago. But at the same time, we're under assault by forces that have a very different set of goals. And we have to keep clear that what I and you are doing, Nadine, and what HAFFS is doing is in support of the proper meaning of open inquiry, and that we shouldn't say, wait a minute, we can't be doing that now because someone else will say we're doing it because we're giving up to external forces. You could easily say that. Some will believe it, but we have to fight that battle as best as we can.
Great. So let me wrap things up then. So I'm going to conclude by thanking Nadine and Jeff for an incredible program today. The work you're doing is truly inspiring, and gives us great hope that we can restore the traditional liberal values of free speech, academic freedom, and open inquiry in our colleges and universities. And thank you, Jeff, as well, for all your excellent work in chairing the working group that prepared the report. I would like to thank everyone in the audience for watching today, and especially thank those of you who are provide the financial support needed to produce programming like this. I encourage each of you to follow Harvard Alumni for Free Speech and each of the other co-sponsors to learn more about how open inquiry and civil discourse are being advanced at Harvard and elsewhere. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you, Nadine. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.